What kind of people would take their most sacred writings, carry them into the wilderness, seal them inside dark caves, and then vanish from history? Imagine standing before a narrow opening cut into the pale cliffs above the Dead Sea. The air is motionless. The desert stretches endlessly in every direction. No cities, no temples, no crowds of pilgrims. Only stone, silence, and the feeling that something has been waiting here for a very long time. Somewhere beyond the darkness of these caves rested words that would remain untouched for nearly 2,000 years. Words copied by careful hands, protected at great cost, hidden with deliberate intention. This is where our investigation begins. Not with a manuscript, not with a discovery, but with a question. Because the deeper one looks into the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the stranger it becomes. The historical record shows that these texts were not random documents abandoned by chance. They included sacred scripture, community regulations, hymns, commentaries, visions of the future, and writings that reflected the hopes and fears of an ancient religious movement. Someone preserved them. Someone transported them. Someone decided they should disappear. Why? The evidence suggests planning. The caves were not libraries in the ordinary sense. They were hiding places. Yet that raises a deeper question. Hidden from whom? Roman soldiers? Religious rivals? A corrupt priesthood? Or perhaps from a world the owners believed was no longer worthy of receiving their message? Some scholars argue that the scrolls were concealed during a time of war, when Roman armies advanced through Judea and communities sought to save what they could. Others remain unconvinced. The difficulty with that interpretation is that it explains how the scrolls may have been hidden, but not necessarily why such an extraordinary collection existed in the first place. The strongest evidence tells us that the people connected to these texts believe they were living in a moment of cosmic significance. They wrote about purity, judgment, divine intervention, and a coming struggle between the forces of light and darkness. Yet instead of proclaiming their message from the rooftops of Jerusalem, they entrusted it to caves overlooking one of the most desolate landscapes in the ancient world. This contradiction lies at the heart of our investigation. The archaeological record can show us where the scrolls were found. It can reveal how they were preserved. It cannot fully explain the minds of those who hid them. And so we stand before the entrance once more, not as tourists looking at an ancient ruin, but as investigators facing a locked door in history. Behind that door waits a mystery that has challenged archaeologists, historians, theologians, and scholars for generations. A mystery preserved not by what was discovered, but by what was intentionally hidden. To understand why the scrolls were hidden, we must first leave the caves behind and step into the world that created them. Imagine standing on the western shore of the Dead Sea sometime during the final centuries before the destruction of Jerusalem. The landscape feels almost otherworldly. Pale limestone cliffs rise above barren valleys. The air is dry and heavy with salt. Sparse vegetation clings to rocky slopes. To the east lies the shimmering surface of the Dead Sea, silent beneath the desert sun. To the west, beyond the wilderness, stretches the heartland of Judea. This was not an isolated corner of the ancient world. It stood at the crossroads of powerful historical forces. Kingdoms had risen and fallen across these lands for centuries. The memory of Babylonian conquest still echoed through sacred tradition. Persian rule had come and gone. Greek influence had spread across the eastern Mediterranean following the campaigns of Alexander. By the 1st century BCE, Roman power was extending its reach across the region. Armies marched. Governors ruled. Taxes were collected. Yet beneath these political realities, another struggle was unfolding. A struggle over identity, purity, authority, and the meaning of God's covenant with his people. The historical record shows that Judaism during the Second Temple period was far from uniform. Different groups offered different answers to the same questions. The Pharisees emphasized interpretation of the law and traditions passed through generations. The Sadducees maintained influence through the temple establishment in Jerusalem. Other groups withdrew from urban centers entirely, believing that the religious leadership of their time had become corrupt. Some scholars argue that the community associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls may have belonged to such a movement. Others remain unconvinced. The archaeological evidence provides clues, but not complete certainty. What does appear clear is that many of the texts found near Qumran emerged from a worldview shaped by expectation. Their authors believed history was moving toward a decisive confrontation. They wrote of divine judgment, cosmic conflict, purification, and the coming triumph of righteousness. This raises an important question. Why did such ideas emerge with such intensity in this period? The evidence suggests that political instability, foreign domination, and religious disagreement created an atmosphere in which apocalyptic thinking flourished. Many communities believed they were living in an age of crisis. The present world seemed broken. The future seemed charged with divine significance. The strongest evidence comes from the scrolls themselves. They repeatedly describe a division between the children of light and the children of darkness, between the faithful remnant and a world perceived as increasingly corrupt. Yet the people who copied these texts were not wandering mystics detached from reality. They lived in settlements. They worked with ink and parchment. They observed ritual practices. They organized communal life according to carefully structured rules. As we move deeper into this investigation, it becomes clear that the caves cannot be understood apart from this larger world. They were created by people shaped by political uncertainty, religious devotion, and a profound conviction that history itself was approaching a turning point. And it is within that tense and expectant world that the mystery of the scrolls first begins to make sense. Imagine entering one of the caves before a single scroll has been touched, before a single fragment has been translated, before history knows what sleeps within the darkness. The entrance is narrow, almost reluctant to reveal itself. Outside, the cliffs of Qumran glow beneath the harsh light of the Judean desert. The Dead Sea stretches across the horizon like polished metal, silent and unmoving beneath the sky. Yet inside the cave, the world changes. The air grows cooler. Light weakens. Stone walls close around you, worn smooth by centuries of wind and silence. At first there appears to be nothing, only shadows. Then slowly, as your eyes adjust, shapes begin to emerge from the darkness. Tall clay jars stand against the limestone walls like silent guardians. Their pale surfaces are coated with dust accumulated over generations. Some remain sealed. Others show the scars of time. The cave feels less like a storage place and more like a sanctuary abandoned by history itself. At the center of this image rests the most powerful symbol of the entire story. A scroll. Not gold. Not jewels. Not a royal crown. A simple roll of parchment wrapped in linen. Yet the strange power of the image lies precisely in that simplicity. Ancient civilizations built temples to preserve sacred things. Kings raised monuments to immortalize their names. But here, hidden inside a barren cave overlooking one of the harshest landscapes in the ancient world, a community entrusted its future to fragile strips of animal skin and ink. The symbolism is profound. Light enters the cave only in narrow beams, illuminating fragments, while leaving the greater chamber concealed. The image almost feels intentional. Knowledge revealed in part. Mystery preserved in shadow. Some scholars argue that the caves were chosen for practical reasons. They offered protection from war, weather, and destruction. Others suggest that the symbolism of caves within ancient religious thought may also have mattered. The difficulty is that archaeology can reveal what was done, but rarely why it was imagined in a particular way. Yet when viewed through the lens of ancient theology, the scene becomes even more striking. Throughout the sacred traditions of the ancient Near East, caves often functioned as thresholds between worlds, places of retreat, places of revelation, places where human beings encountered realities hidden from ordinary life. This raises a deeper question. Were these scrolls simply hidden documents, or were they placed within a symbolic landscape already charged with sacred meaning? The archaeological record cannot fully answer. But standing within this imagined scene, surrounded by jars, parchment, stone, and silence, one begins to understand why the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls feels less like the opening of a library and more like the opening of a sealed chamber within the memory of civilization itself. The caves of Qumran did not emerge from a peaceful world. They emerged from a landscape of conflict. To understand why these scrolls were copied, preserved, and ultimately hidden, we must investigate the tensions that shaped the people who produced them. The historical record shows that Judea during the final centuries before the destruction of Jerusalem was marked by profound religious disagreement. At the center of Jewish life stood the temple, a magnificent structure of stone and gold that functioned not only as a place of worship, but also as a symbol of national identity. Yet beneath the appearance of unity, competing visions of faith struggled for authority. Who truly represented the covenant? Who correctly interpreted the law? Who possessed legitimate religious leadership? The evidence suggests that these questions were far from settled. Some groups worked within the temple system. Others criticized it. Some accepted existing priestly authority. Others viewed it as corrupted. This raises our first major question. Were the people connected to the Dead Sea Scrolls retreating from society because they sought greater spiritual purity, or because they believed the religious establishment itself had become illegitimate? Some scholars argue that the scrolls preserve the voice of a separatist movement that deliberately withdrew from Jerusalem. The community rule and related texts describe strict standards of conduct, ritual purity, and communal discipline. Such evidence appears to support the idea of a group that saw itself as distinct from the wider society. Yet others remain unconvinced. The difficulty with this interpretation is that the archaeological record does not conclusively prove that the settlement at Qumran housed a single isolated sect throughout its history. Alternative explanations remain possible. Political conflict added another layer of uncertainty. Roman influence expanded across Judea. Local rulers governed under imperial authority. Rebellions erupted. Tensions increased. The evidence suggests that many Jewish groups interpreted these events not merely as political developments, but as signs of a larger spiritual crisis. Texts such as the War Scroll describe a future cosmic confrontation between the forces of light and darkness. This language is striking, but how should it be understood? Some scholars argue that such texts reflect literal apocalyptic expectations. Others suggest they may function as symbolic expressions of communal identity and resistance. The strongest evidence comes from the texts themselves, yet interpretation remains contested. The theological conflict may have been even deeper than the political one. Many scrolls reveal intense concern with purity, judgment, divine election, and the correct interpretation of sacred tradition. The authors repeatedly distinguish between the righteous and the wicked, between those who possess truth and those who have strayed from it. But who exactly were these opponents? Corrupt priests? Rival Jewish groups? Foreign rulers? The archaeological record cannot fully answer. The names are often hidden behind symbolic language and theological categories. This forces us to proceed carefully. The temptation is to simplify the conflict into a struggle between heroes and villains. The evidence does not allow such certainty. What it reveals instead is a society fractured by competing visions of religious authority, political legitimacy, and divine purpose. My reading of the evidence is that the Dead Sea Scrolls emerged from a world where multiple communities believe they alone understood the direction of history. Yet the debate remains open. The caves preserve the voices of one side of the argument. The challenge for us is determining how much of the larger conversation has been lost to time. As we move deeper into the caves, the mystery shifts from where the scrolls were hidden to what was actually hidden inside them. At first glance, many people imagine the Dead Sea Scrolls as a collection of ancient biblical manuscripts. That description is partly correct, but it is also incomplete. The archaeological record shows that the caves preserved a library far more diverse than many expected. Alongside copies of sacred scriptures were community regulations, hymns, legal interpretations, apocalyptic visions, commentaries, liturgical writings, and texts that do not fit neatly into any modern category. This raises an important question. What kind of community creates such a library? The evidence suggests a group deeply concerned with preserving knowledge, identity, and theological interpretation. Yet some of the most fascinating discoveries emerge from texts that remained largely unknown before the caves were opened. Consider the War Scroll. This document describes a future struggle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The language is vivid, symbolic, and highly structured. Some scholars argue that it reflects literal expectations of an approaching end-time conflict. Others remain unconvinced. The difficulty with that interpretation is that ancient religious literature often employed military imagery symbolically. The text may reveal expectations of divine intervention, but precisely how those expectations were understood remains debated. Another remarkable document is the Community Rule. This text outlines admission procedures, disciplinary measures, ritual practices, and the structure of communal life. The historical record shows a society intensely focused on purity and order. Yet even here uncertainty remains. Were these regulations fully implemented in daily life, or do they represent an idealized vision of how the community wished to function? The evidence cannot answer with complete confidence. Then there is the Great Isaiah Scroll, one of the most famous manuscripts ever discovered. The strongest evidence comes from textual comparison. Scholars found that this ancient copy preserved much of the biblical text with remarkable consistency across centuries. Yet differences also exist. Variations in wording, spelling, and phrasing remind us that sacred texts were transmitted through human hands. This discovery challenged older assumptions that textual traditions remained entirely fixed. Perhaps the most mysterious document of all is the Copper Scroll. Unlike the other scrolls written on parchment or papyrus, this text was engraved onto sheets of copper. Its contents are equally unusual. Rather than hymns, laws, or prophecy, it appears to describe locations associated with hidden treasures. Some scholars argue that it records actual deposits of valuables concealed before a period of crisis. Others remain skeptical. The difficulty with treating it as a literal treasure map is that no corresponding cache has ever been definitively identified. Yet neither has the text been fully explained. This raises a deeper question. Why does a collection focused largely on theology and scripture contain a document of such a different character? My reading of the evidence is that the hidden texts of Qumran reveal something more important than any single secret. They reveal a community attempting to preserve an entire worldview. History, law, prophecy, ritual, identity, memory, and expectation were all stored together within the caves. Yet the debate remains open. Were these texts the library of a single movement, fragments from multiple communities, or the surviving remains of a much larger intellectual landscape now lost to history? The scrolls continue to speak, but they do not always speak with one voice. At this stage of our investigation, the scrolls begin to reveal something beyond their words. They reveal a symbolic universe. Ancient communities rarely separated theology, history, and symbolism in the way modern readers often do. For them, the physical world itself could reflect deeper spiritual realities. A cave was not merely a cave. A wilderness was not merely a wilderness. A scroll was not merely a document. To understand why the Dead Sea Scrolls continue to fascinate historians and theologians alike, we must examine the symbols embedded within both the texts and the landscape that preserve them. Let us begin with the cave itself. The archaeological record shows that the manuscripts were stored in caves overlooking the Dead Sea. On a practical level, this choice makes sense. The caves offered protection from humidity, conflict, and destruction. Yet symbolism may also have played a role. Throughout ancient Near Eastern literature, caves frequently appear as places of transition and revelation. Prophets retreat into wilderness spaces. Sacred encounters occur far from cities and royal courts. Hidden places become settings where divine truth is revealed or preserved. Some scholars argue that the caves of Qumran may have carried similar symbolic resonance. Others remain cautious, noting that practical necessity alone could explain their use. The evidence cannot fully determine intention, yet the symbolic association remains difficult to ignore. Another powerful symbol emerges from the repeated contrast between light and darkness found throughout several scrolls. The War Scroll and related texts describe a cosmic struggle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. It would be easy to read this language as a simple division between good and evil. The difficulty with that interpretation is that ancient symbolic systems often operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Light could represent truth, covenant faithfulness, divine order, or communal identity. Darkness could symbolize error, impurity, chaos, or opposition to God's purposes. The strongest evidence suggests that these symbols functioned as theological language through which a community understood its place in history. The scroll itself also carries symbolic significance. In an age when writing materials required substantial labor and resources, a manuscript represented more than information. It embodied memory, authority, continuity. Every copied line connected the present generation to those who came before. The Great Isaiah Scroll is especially revealing in this regard. It survived because someone believed that preserving sacred words was worth extraordinary effort. This raises a deeper question. Were the scrolls intended merely to record tradition, or did their creators view them as active participants in the preservation of divine truth? The archaeological evidence cannot answer directly, but the care invested in their production suggests that these texts possessed significance beyond ordinary documents. Even the wilderness surrounding Qumran functions symbolically. Across biblical and ancient Jewish traditions, the desert often appears as a place of testing, purification, and preparation. It is a landscape stripped of distraction, a place where communities redefine themselves. Some scholars argue that the choice to live near such a landscape reflected theological convictions about separation from a corrupt society. Others remain unconvinced, pointing out that symbolism alone cannot explain settlement patterns. Yet the convergence of text, geography, and religious imagination remains striking. My reading of the evidence is that the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve not only ideas but an entire symbolic worldview. The caves, the wilderness, the scrolls, the language of light and darkness, all form part of a coherent system through which an ancient community interpreted reality itself. Yet the debate remains open. Whether these symbols reflected lived experience, theological ideals, or a combination of both is a question that continues to challenge scholars. And perhaps that uncertainty is itself part of the mystery the caves have preserved. Every major archaeological discovery attracts interpretations that extend far beyond the evidence itself. The Dead Sea Scrolls are no exception. As the manuscripts began to emerge from the caves of Qumran, scholars, theologians, and the public alike confronted a troubling possibility. What if these texts revealed a version of ancient Judaism far more complex than previously imagined? What if they forced historians to reconsider assumptions about the origins of certain religious ideas? This is where our investigation enters more controversial territory. One of the most debated interpretations concerns the identity of the community behind the scrolls. The traditional scholarly view associates the manuscripts with the Essenes, a Jewish group described by ancient writers such as Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder. The evidence supporting this interpretation includes communal regulations, ritual practices, and the apparent isolation of the Qumran settlement. Yet some scholars remain unconvinced. The difficulty with the Essene hypothesis is that the archaeological record does not align perfectly with every detail preserved in the ancient descriptions. As a result, alternative theories emerged. Some researchers have proposed that the scrolls may have originated in Jerusalem and were hidden in the caves by refugees fleeing the Roman advance. Others suggest that the collection reflects contributions from multiple groups rather than a single community. The evidence remains incomplete, and the debate continues. Another controversial interpretation involves the relationship between the scrolls and early Christianity. The historical record shows that certain themes found within the manuscripts resemble ideas later associated with Christian texts. References to a coming Messiah, expectations of divine judgment, ritual washing, communal meals, and a cosmic struggle between light and darkness appear throughout the scrolls. Some scholars argue that these parallels demonstrate how both movements emerge from a shared religious environment within Second Temple Judaism. Others remain cautious. The strongest evidence suggests similarity, but similarity is not proof of direct influence. The difficulty with more sensational interpretations is that they often blur the distinction between historical context and historical dependence. Yet the question remains fascinating. How closely related were the worlds that produced the scrolls and the earliest Christian communities? The archaeological record cannot fully answer. Then there is the most intriguing interpretation of all. Some scholars have suggested that the caves themselves may have been part of a larger strategy of preservation extending beyond a temporary response to war. According to this view, the community expected a coming catastrophe and intentionally stored its writings for a future generation. The evidence supporting this idea comes from the apocalyptic character of many texts. If a group believed history was approaching a divine climax, preserving sacred writings for survivors of that future crisis might have seemed entirely rational. Others remain unconvinced. The difficulty with this interpretation is that direct evidence for such intentions is limited. The manuscripts speak extensively about judgment and expectation, but they do not explicitly explain why the caves were chosen. My reading of the evidence is that these forbidden interpretations remain valuable not because they provide definitive answers, but because they force us to confront the limits of certainty. They remind us that archaeology reveals artifacts, not intentions. Manuscripts preserve voices, but not always their full context. Historical reconstruction is therefore an exercise in probability rather than absolute certainty. Yet the debate remains open. And perhaps that is why the Dead Sea Scrolls continue to inspire controversy. They stand at the intersection of evidence and imagination, where every answer generates a deeper question, and where the silence of the caves still leaves room for possibilities history has not completely resolved. At the center of the Dead Sea Scrolls mystery lies a question that archaeology alone has never fully resolved. Who owned these manuscripts, and why were they hidden in the caves overlooking the Dead Sea? The evidence is substantial, but it does not point in only one direction. Instead, it has given rise to several competing theories, each supported by certain facts and challenged by others. Let us examine the two most influential interpretations. The first is often called the Essene theory. According to this view, the scrolls belong primarily to a Jewish sect known as the Essenes, a community that deliberately separated itself from mainstream society. The historical record provides several reasons why many scholars support this hypothesis. Ancient writers such as Josephus, Philo, and Pliny describe groups living disciplined communal lives, practicing ritual purity, and distancing themselves from the political and religious conflicts of Jerusalem. The community rule found among the scrolls appears consistent with such a lifestyle. Archaeological excavations at Qumran have uncovered communal facilities, ritual baths, and evidence suggesting a structured religious settlement. The evidence suggests a plausible connection, yet others remain unconvinced. The difficulty with the Essene theory is that the archaeological record does not fit every detail perfectly. Some scholars argue that the settlement may have served multiple functions across different periods. Others note that none of the scrolls explicitly identify their authors as Essenes. The strongest evidence is circumstantial rather than definitive. This brings us to the second major interpretation, often called the Jerusalem Library theory. According to this view, the scrolls were not the library of a single desert sect at all. Instead, they may represent manuscripts gathered from various locations in Jerusalem and hidden in the caves during the Roman advance in the 1st century CE. The evidence supporting this interpretation comes from the diversity of the collection itself. More than 900 manuscripts and fragments have been identified, containing a remarkable range of literary styles, theological perspectives, and textual traditions. Some scholars argue that such diversity is more consistent with a broader urban library than with a small, isolated community. Yet this theory faces challenges of its own. If the scrolls originated primarily in Jerusalem, why is there archaeological evidence for manuscript production and communal activity at Qumran? Why do certain texts appear to reflect a highly specific communal identity? The archaeological record cannot fully answer. A third possibility has emerged in more recent scholarship. Some researchers suggest that the debate itself may be too narrowly framed. Perhaps the scrolls originated through a combination of sources. Perhaps Qumran housed a community connected to some manuscripts while also receiving texts from elsewhere. The evidence suggests this hybrid approach may explain certain contradictions better than either extreme position. Yet the debate remains open because no single theory accounts perfectly for every piece of evidence. My reading of the evidence is that the scrolls preserve traces of a religious world more complex than any one label can easily capture. The caves reveal fragments of a conversation rather than the voice of a single speaker. Historical fact tells us where the manuscripts were found. Archaeological evidence reveals how they were stored. Scholarly interpretation attempts to explain why. But certainty remains elusive. And perhaps that leads us to the most important question of all. If the scrolls truly represent multiple voices arguing about truth, authority, and the future of Israel, are we uncovering the library of one community, or the surviving echoes of an entire lost intellectual world? At this point in our investigation, we leave the realm of theory and return to the evidence buried in stone, clay, parchment, and landscape. Archaeology cannot tell us everything. It cannot recover every lost voice or reconstruct every forgotten intention. yet it can preserve echoes. And in the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, those echoes remain remarkably powerful. Let us begin with the caves themselves. Scattered across the limestone cliffs near Qumran, these natural chambers overlook one of the most austere landscapes in the ancient world. The archaeological record shows that manuscripts were discovered in multiple caves rather than a single hidden location. Some contained nearly complete scrolls, others preserved only fragments. This pattern immediately raises a question. Were the scrolls hidden during a single event or over an extended period of time? The evidence suggests possibilities, but no definitive answer. The caves remain silent on the matter. Nearby lies the settlement of Qumran. Excavations have revealed stone structures, communal spaces, water installations, pottery workshops, and numerous ritual baths. Some scholars argue that these remains support the idea of a religious community devoted to purity and disciplined communal life. Others remain cautious. The difficulty with interpreting archaeological sites is that buildings rarely announce their purpose. A room may have served one function in one generation and another function in the next. The archaeological evidence establishes that people lived and worked here. It does not fully reveal who they were. Among the most important discoveries are the storage jars themselves. Tall ceramic vessels with distinctive lids were found within several caves. These jars are not merely containers. They represent deliberate preservation. Someone invested labor into protecting fragile manuscripts from moisture, insects, and decay. The strongest evidence comes from the remarkable condition of certain texts, particularly the Great Isaiah Scroll. Preserved for more than 2 millennia, it stands as one of the most extraordinary examples of textual survival in the ancient world. Yet the manuscripts are only part of the story. Archaeology also connects the scrolls to a broader network of historical memory. Similar ritual baths appear elsewhere in Judea. Comparable styles of pottery are known from other sites of the period. These parallels do not prove direct relationships, but they situate Qumran within the cultural landscape of Second Temple Judaism. The evidence suggests continuity with wider traditions, even as certain texts emphasize separation from the surrounding world. Another fascinating echo comes from the copper scroll. Unlike the parchment manuscripts, this text was engraved onto metal. Archaeologically, it stands apart from the rest of the collection. Some scholars interpret it as evidence of hidden wealth. Others regard it as symbolic or literary. No corresponding treasure has ever been conclusively identified. The archaeological record, therefore, confirms the existence of the document, but not necessarily the reality of what it describes. This distinction is crucial. Archaeology verifies objects more easily than ideas. Beyond Qumran, echoes of the scrolls appear in broader historical traditions. Ancient Jewish literature, apocalyptic writings, and later religious texts share themes found within the manuscripts. Such similarities do not always indicate direct influence. Sometimes they reflect a common intellectual environment. Sometimes they represent cultural memory rather than direct transmission. The evidence must be weighed carefully. My reading of the evidence is that the Dead Sea Scrolls are best understood not as isolated artifacts, but as fragments of a larger world. The caves, jars, settlement, manuscripts, and surrounding landscape form a network of clues pointing toward a community deeply engaged with questions of identity, purity, prophecy, and survival. Yet the archaeological record cannot fully answer the question that still lingers over Qumran. Did the caves preserve the final remnants of a disappearing movement, or are they merely the surviving corner of a much larger historical picture that is yet to be uncovered? To understand the deepest significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we must attempt something difficult. We must temporarily set aside modern assumptions and enter the religious imagination of the people who produced these texts. For them, theology was not an abstract subject discussed in isolation from daily life. It was the framework through which history, politics, suffering, nature, and destiny were understood. The question was not simply what people believed. The question was how they interpreted the world itself. The historical record shows that many of the scrolls emerged from a worldview saturated with expectation. Their authors did not see themselves as living in ordinary times. The evidence suggests they believed history was approaching a decisive moment. This conviction appears repeatedly throughout the manuscripts. References to judgment, purification, divine intervention, and cosmic conflict are woven into their writings. But what did these ideas actually mean to the people who preserved them? Some scholars argue that the community viewed itself as a faithful remnant living amid widespread corruption. The community rule and related texts repeatedly distinguish between the righteous and the wicked, the faithful and the unfaithful. Yet this distinction was not merely moral. It was theological. The world was understood as divided between competing spiritual realities. The famous imagery of the sons of light and the sons of darkness reflects this perspective. Modern readers sometimes interpret such language as a simple metaphor for good and evil. The difficulty with that interpretation is that ancient theological thought often operated on multiple levels at once. These categories described not only ethical choices, but also communal identity, covenant loyalty, and one's place within a larger divine drama. This raises a deeper question. Did the authors believe they were observing history or participating in it? The strongest evidence suggests the latter. The scrolls reveal a community that understood itself as occupying a significant role within a sacred narrative already unfolding. Another important theological theme concerns revelation. The evidence shows that the authors placed extraordinary emphasis on the correct interpretation of sacred texts. Scripture was not viewed as a closed collection of ancient writings. It was a living source of hidden meaning. Many commentaries found among the scrolls attempt to connect prophetic passages with events unfolding in the author's own time. Some scholars argue that this reflects a belief that divine truth becomes progressively clearer as history approaches its fulfillment. Others remain cautious, noting that interpretive traditions varied widely throughout Second Temple Judaism. Yet the theological pattern remains visible. Sacred texts were not simply read. They were decoded. The expectation of a coming Messiah also occupies an important place within the scrolls, though not always in ways later readers might expect. The evidence suggests that multiple messianic figures were anticipated in some traditions. Priestly leaders, royal deliverers, and prophetic figures appear within various texts. This diversity reminds us that ancient Jewish expectations were more complex than a single unified doctrine. The archaeological record confirms the existence of these writings, but their precise theological relationships remain debated. My reading of the evidence is that the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal a community attempting to locate itself within sacred history. Their theology was not primarily concerned with abstract speculation. It was concerned with orientation. Who are we? Where do we stand within God's purposes? How should we live while awaiting what comes next? These questions shaped their interpretation of Scripture, community, purity, and destiny. Yet the debate remains open. The scrolls preserve answers offered by one ancient community, but they also preserve something more enduring: the human desire to find meaning within history and to believe that the turbulence of the present belongs to a larger story whose final chapter has not yet been revealed. As our investigation moves beyond manuscripts, caves, and competing historical theories, we arrive at a question that may be older than any scroll ever placed inside the cliffs of Qumran. Why do human beings preserve words for a future they will never see? The Dead Sea Scrolls are often studied as archaeological artifacts, religious documents, or historical evidence. Yet beneath all of these categories lies a more fundamental human story. Somewhere in the ancient world, individuals sat beneath the light of oil lamps, preparing parchment, mixing ink, and carefully copying texts that they believed mattered. Many of those individuals almost certainly understood a simple reality. They would die. The scrolls might survive. This realization introduces a philosophical dimension often hidden beneath the details of archaeology. The historical record shows that the communities associated with the scrolls lived in a world shaped by uncertainty. Empires expanded and collapsed. Armies crossed borders. Political alliances shifted. Famine, disease, and violence remained constant possibilities. Human life was fragile. Yet the response preserved within the caves was not silence. It was writing. This raises a deeper question. What does a person choose to preserve when confronted by impermanence? Some communities preserve wealth. Others preserve monuments. Others preserve stories. The evidence suggests that the people connected to the scrolls chose to preserve meaning. They copied interpretations, laws, hymns, prophecies, and visions because they believed certain truths deserved survival beyond the lifespan of those who recorded them. Yet another layer of the mystery appears here. The same people who sought preservation also embraced concealment. The scrolls were not displayed in public squares. They were hidden. The difficulty with interpreting this decision is that it can be understood in multiple ways. Some scholars emphasize practical concerns such as war and survival. Others see evidence of a deeper theological expectation. My reading of the evidence is that both possibilities may reflect a common human impulse. When people believe something possesses profound value, they often seek to protect it from forces capable of destroying it. The caves become symbols of that protective instinct. They function almost like a conversation between generations separated by centuries. The ancient scribes could not know who would eventually discover their writings. They could not predict languages, cultures, or civilizations yet to emerge. Yet they acted as though the future mattered. This reveals something important about the ancient search for the sacred. Theology, in this context, was not merely an attempt to understand divine realities. It was also an attempt to locate human existence within a larger framework of meaning. The scrolls repeatedly reflect a desire to understand where history is going, why suffering exists, and how finite lives participate in something greater than themselves. The evidence suggests that these questions were not unique to one community. They appear throughout ancient religious literature across many traditions. The archaeological record preserves one expression of that search. It cannot tell us whether the answers were correct. It can show us that the questions were considered essential. Perhaps this is why the scrolls continue to fascinate scholars. Not because they eliminate uncertainty, but because they reveal how ancient people confronted it. The caves preserved texts, but they also preserved a state of mind. A willingness to seek meaning beyond immediate circumstances. A conviction that truth, however understood, was worth protecting. And an awareness that the deepest mysteries of existence might remain only partially visible, like fragments of parchment emerging from darkness, while the greater chamber beyond remains hidden from view. We have followed the evidence from the cliffs of Qumran into the darkness of the caves. We have examined manuscripts, pottery, settlements, theological ideas, competing theories, and the silent landscape that preserved them. Now we arrive at the point where every historical investigation must confront its limits. Not the limits of curiosity, but the limits of certainty. The historical record shows that the Dead Sea Scrolls are among the most important archaeological discoveries ever made. That much is beyond dispute. They preserved ancient biblical texts centuries older than those previously known. They revealed the intellectual diversity of Second Temple Judaism. They provided direct access to voices that had been silent for nearly 2,000 years. These are historical facts. The archaeological evidence is equally powerful. The caves existed. The jars existed. The manuscripts existed. The settlement at Qumran existed. The physical traces remain before us. Yet when we move from evidence to interpretation, the terrain becomes less certain. Were the scrolls the library of the Essenes? Some scholars argue yes. The textual and archaeological clues appear to point in that direction. Others remain unconvinced. The diversity of the manuscripts suggests a broader origin. The archaeological record cannot fully settle the question. Were the scrolls hidden because of the Roman advance? The evidence suggests that possibility. Yet the difficulty with that interpretation is that it explains the act of concealment without fully explaining the deeper worldview reflected within the texts themselves. Were these manuscripts intended merely for preservation, or were they entrusted to the future by a community expecting a coming transformation of history? Again, the evidence points toward possibilities rather than certainties. Yet when all these layers are considered together, a larger pattern begins to emerge. The strongest evidence comes not from any single manuscript, cave, or theory. It emerges from the relationship between them. The people connected to these texts appear to have believed that history possessed meaning. They believed sacred writings mattered. They believed the present age was unstable. They believed the future would reveal truths hidden from the present. Whether their expectations were fulfilled is a theological question beyond the reach of archaeology. What archaeology can reveal is that these convictions shaped real decisions made by real people. They copied texts. They organized communities. They preserved traditions. And at some point, they placed those traditions into caves. My reading of the evidence is that the greatest secret of the Dead Sea Scrolls may not be found within any individual line of text. It may be found within the act of preservation itself. Consider the paradox. A community sought to protect its understanding of truth by hiding it. In doing so, it disappeared from history while its writings survived. The people vanished. The manuscripts remained. The voices endured after the speakers were gone. This raises a profound historical reflection. Human beings often attempt to preserve monuments, power, institutions, and names. Yet time erodes nearly all of them. The scrolls suggest another possibility. Ideas may travel further than the people who create them. The archaeological record cannot fully explain why the caves became their resting place. Scholarly interpretation continues to debate who hid them and under what circumstances. Yet the evidence suggests something remarkable. The silence of the caves succeeded where public memory failed. The scrolls survived precisely because they were removed from history. And perhaps that is the final revelation. The greatest mysteries are not always hidden because someone wishes to conceal them. Sometimes they survive because history forgot where they were left. Yet the debate remains open, and the caves continue to guard part of their secret even now. As our investigation comes to an end, I find myself returning to the caves one final time. Not as an archaeologist carrying excavation tools, not as a historian searching for dates and chronologies, not even as a theologian examining ancient beliefs. I return as a witness standing before a mystery that remains only partially understood. The scrolls have spoken. The evidence has been examined. The theories have been weighed. Yet something continues to resist final explanation. The historical record shows us where the manuscripts were found. Archaeology reveals how they survived. Scholarship offers increasingly sophisticated interpretations of who may have written them and why they were preserved. But none of these disciplines can completely bridge the distance between ourselves and the people who carried those scrolls into the caves. Somewhere in that ancient landscape, decisions were made. Hands rolled parchment. Jars were sealed. Paths through the wilderness were traveled for what may have been the final time. Then silence followed. Generations passed. Empires rose and disappeared. Languages evolved. Entire civilizations forgot what had been hidden among the cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea. Yet the manuscripts remained. This raises a question that reaches beyond Qumran itself. The evidence suggests that the people connected to these texts believed they understood the direction of history. They expected judgment. They anticipated transformation. They viewed themselves as participants in a sacred drama larger than their own lives. But here we encounter a remarkable irony. Whatever future they imagined, it was not the future that eventually found their scrolls. The readers they expected never arrived. Instead, their words emerged into a world they could not have conceived. A world speaking different languages, living under different empires, asking different questions. The difficulty with historical investigation is that it often reveals how little we truly know about the intentions of those who came before us. We can reconstruct contexts. We can analyze texts. We can compare evidence. Yet intention remains elusive. Why these caves? Why these manuscripts? Why this act of concealment? Some scholars argue that survival was the goal. Others suggest preparation for an approaching crisis. Others remain unconvinced that a single explanation can account for the complexity of the evidence. The archaeological record cannot fully answer, and perhaps it never will. My reading of the evidence is that the deepest mystery of the Dead Sea Scrolls may not concern what was hidden. It may concern what the act of hiding reveals about the human condition itself. Ancient people looked toward an uncertain future and chose to entrust something precious to time. They acted without knowing whether anyone would ever find what they preserved. There is something profoundly revealing in that gesture. It speaks of hope, fear, conviction, uncertainty, and a belief that truth possesses value beyond the lifespan of its guardians. Yet the debate remains open. The caves still withhold part of their story. The manuscripts continue to generate new questions. And perhaps the final question is not whether the Dead Sea Scrolls contain secrets. We already know that they do. The deeper question is this: if a community truly believed it possessed the final understanding of history, why did it leave that understanding in the care of silent caves rather than living people? And what does that decision reveal about their confidence in humanity itself?